we have Kirsten Thompson speaking with Jody Becker, Chief Strategy Officer and EVP Infrastructure Services and Technology at EllisDon, and with Karl Schober, a Senior Associate in our Privacy and Data Security Advertising and Transformative Technologies and Data Strategy Group. Kirsten is a partner in our corporate group in Toronto and is the national lead of the Transformative Technologies and Data Strategy Group. She is also a key member of the Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. She has both an advisory and an advocacy practice and provides privacy, data security, and data management advice to clients in a wide variety of industries. Kirsten's practice has a particular concentration in data-driven industries and disruptive technologies, and she is a leading practitioner in areas such as fintech, including blockchain and smart contracts, digital identity, vehicle telematics, and connected infrastructure, big data, data analytics, applications, and enterprise data strategy. Karl advises on all matters related to privacy law and data governance in the emerging technology sphere, including wearable devices, smart homes, connected and autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and the Internet of Things. Kirsten and Karl, over to you to introduce Jody and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions because you just heard a lot about Karl and myself, but I am going to turn it over to Jody to introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon. I guess it is now. Thanks very much, Kirsten and Karl, for inviting me to speak today. My role here at EllisDon covers a few things. As the EVP of Infrastructure Services and Technology, I oversee a number of our services within a construction company that include our facilities management team. We oversee both vertical and horizontal infrastructure, including hospitals, courthouses, and LRTs, as well as our particularly important for today's discussion, I think, is our energy and digital services team, which is our really our team focused around intelligent infrastructure and smart cities, as well as our project management and advisory teams in Canada and internationally, and our sustainability team. So thanks very much for
Thanks for joining us, and we look forward to this discussion. It's always insightful when we get an opportunity to speak with you. Our last opportunity to speak with you was about a year ago on a similar panel, and I was just wondering what developments have occurred in the smart city space since you last spoke with us.
Well, gosh, everything in last year, hasn't it? Everything I think that we do these days involves tech, whether it's this type of a webinar, whether we're working from home, whether we are having Zoom beers with friends, whether we are, ordering our groceries online or even doing a virtual yoga session these days. Everything is involving tech now that we are living in a COVID environment. So I think from a business perspective, we've seen that explosion of around the need for connectivity and interoperability between systems in our infrastructure as well. Over the last number of months, I would say on the energy and digital services side, our pursuits and the sort of business development side of the business has tripled. And again, I think that's really as a result of what we're seeing. We're also seeing that where smart cities and intelligent infrastructure was nice to have pre-COVID, it's now becoming really essential for everything we do. So we see even in the purpose-built rental residential environment, the demand for things like fiber to the suites in order to enable all of the technology that people will have within those spaces. That's a new demand that we would not have seen over the past number of years. I think also as it relates to how we are managing the infrastructure that we manage on our facilities and infrastructure side of things, we are looking at new ways to drive efficiencies out of those assets, and that we are utilizing technology in a number of different ways in order to do that. So now we are working with centralized management platforms that are really visual depictions of everything that's happening within a building. What we're really trying to do through those visual depictions is listen to what the building is telling us, or listen to what the infrastructure is telling us, so that we can not only identify where we are being inefficient, or where we are utilizing too much energy, or where a particular piece of mechanical equipment is malfunctioning. We can identify it visually, we can diagnose it, and in some cases, we can automatically fix the problem through those types of platforms. We've also found over the last number of months that understanding what is happening on our construction sites and having access to the data around what's happening on our construction sites is of vital importance. So while we are all back to work on our construction sites, the way in which we work has dramatically changed. And we have to maintain physical distancing on sites. We have to limit the number of people that are in our hoists. And so data around the number of people that are on site, the people that are coming in contact with each other, and the productivity levels that are being impacted, all is being managed and monitored through the use of technology, so that when it comes time to reconcile the impacts of COVID with our clients, we have the data accessible to us. Everything has changed in a year.
So that was kind of a leading question. Maybe I should have scoped it a little more narrowly. That's all very interesting. So I assume then that there's an increased demand for these technologies and all this data. And we heard on the previous panel, my colleague Paniota speaking about the ways to protect that data. But what are you seeing on the ground on projects? Like, how do you sort out who has the rights to which data?
In terms of ownership of data, it's certainly a hot topic issue, and as Ellis Don, we're very conscious of our own data and the protection of our own data. It's very important to us, and similarly, it's very important to us to protect the data of our clients. But it does become a bit more complicated when you look at certain types of projects. For example, we have a number of P3 hospitals that we operate. And when we construct those hospitals, we often do so with two networks. We'll run an entire network through the hospital that will manage and operate the asset. And we run a separate network through the hospital that will be used for the hospital's specific needs, including healthcare information, that kind of thing. We will not touch that kind of network, and that remains completely proprietary to the hospital. And we wouldn't have any access over that. In terms of the data around the operation of the building, however, that's where it can become a bit gray. Obviously the data itself, is proprietary to the hospital. It is the owner of the building. It intrinsically owns the data around it. However, it is very important for us to manage and utilize that data in order to make sure that the building is running efficiently and properly and in accordance with our performance obligations under that kind of a project model. So we have to work together on it, but certainly there is crossover on how that data is utilized.
Karl, what about from your perspective? You look at the paperwork behind all of this and the law. Do you see more contractual clauses addressing data? And what are the types of issues that are arising from where you sit?
Sure. So I'm certainly seeing more and more contracts involving provisions relating to data and, if relevant, personal information, including arrangements where we would never have seen them before. The practice is certainly moving in the right direction. However, it's still not universal practice. We're also, of course, seeing more complex arrangements, which equally creates more complex and careful thought around what an appropriate data provision or privacy provisions should be. It's been mentioned a few times, including in the last segment or presentation, we're seeing issues around data ownership. Everyone wants to own the data, and depending on the arrangement, this may not be possible. So the parties involved will want to think about, what is an appropriate mechanism or mechanisms that would work for them. For example, such as a perpetual license. And if you're worried about your competitors, then you may want to consider sort of perhaps provisions or restrictions around the data itself. This is, in particular importance if you say have identified a revenue stream for this data, which is obviously core to your need as a business. We're still seeing quite a few sort of competing regimes or perhaps competing uses of data. This is clearly seen in sort of a P3 model. So the public sector entity is generally limited by its own statute of how it can use the information generally. And generally that's just sort of to provide the public service. On the private sector side, of course, whether it's a tech company or a developer, it'll likely have its own interests in the information and what it wants to do with it, usually perhaps for a secondary commercial purpose. So depending on these sort of competing regimes and competing data uses, this will certainly want to be articulated appropriately in your arrangements. You might also have, and I've seen this a few times, competing interests in the event of, say, a data breach. In particular, if there's a breach of personal information. So we've seen issues where two or more organizations are collaborating in some form, whether that's a partnership agreement or a network agreement or some other type of contract, but the arrangement doesn't have any clear language about who has responsibility to manage the data breach. And if we're dealing with, say, personal information in those circumstances, whether that breach triggers privacy laws. And so the parties that are involved might disagree on the severity of the breach and whether you need to trigger reporting obligations to privacy commissioner or to notify affected individuals. So we might have quite a conflict in that case. So parties who may fall into this sort of area may want to consider language that clearly defines who has the decision-making power. And of course, define what a breach means, whether the breach was caused by party A, caused by party B, by an unknown malicious actor, by a constellation of things. Those things will want to be sorted out so that in the event of such an incident, you're not sort of dealing with this kind of vagueness in your arrangement.
That's very helpful. I assume that covers off the confidentiality and non-personal information as well as personal information. You put those contractual provisions in place?
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, we've talked a bit about the participants in the smart city ecosystem, but Jodi, what about LSDON itself? What sort of things are you doing yourself with the data?
Unmute myself there. It's a good question with a complicated answer, I think, as with many industries and many companies. Where we are very focused on protecting our data, very focused on utilizing our data in effective ways, as Karl just said. There is a commercial intent behind what we are doing. But within the construction industry, we are quite often, I would say, criticized for two things. There are efficiency and transparency. And so from an LSDON point of view, we are focused on utilizing the data in effective ways that will make us both more efficient and more transparent to our clients and to our subcontractors. So while we very much believe that controlling our own data means controlling our own destiny and not being beholden to other providers of platforms out there that may be also looking to utilize our data to advance their own commercial purposes. We also think it's really important to make that data available in effective ways so that we can be more transparent through the kind of typical construction pyramid or even through the operations process. So one of the more interesting things that we're doing right now is we've created a product together with some industry partners that is focused around gathering and collating information about our subcontractors, not just for LSDON, but for the industry as a whole. So we've created a platform whereby subcontractors will submit their information as they would do in the normal course to any contractor, general contractor. They would provide information around their financial health. They would provide health and safety information. They might provide information around insurance and bonding. And typically they would have to do that for every contractor in the industry several times throughout the year in order to be qualified for projects. We've created a platform together with our industry partners that allows the subcontracting market to submit that information in a secure and protected way and makes it available to the subscribers of that platform so that it's readily available. They don't have to go through that process over and over again. And it provides anonymized data about their competitors as well. So they have the ability to see how they're faring against other market players from the point of view of this kind of anonymized rating system. So again, that's in an effort to provide transparency across the industry, work with our industry partners, and really utilize that data to drive more efficient projects.
Thanks. We've mostly been talking about the uses of data in the commercial applications, but smart residential is increasingly becoming a thing. Typically, these are condo developments or similarly fully integrated condo and retail developments. Everything is voice activated. There's speakers embedded. I'm looking at Karl's condo right now to see if I can see any of the embedded smart technologies behind him. These types of buildings and services often use a lot of personal information. So, Karl, I wonder if you can comment, are the considerations different in residential builds?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're certainly seeing many residential projects that are advertising basically a smart condo or smart units, obviously, with these sort of integrated smart devices. And this is well beyond sort of the smart appliances that we've sort of become used to now, or perhaps, sort of these add-ons or promotional incentives, which are sort of, with the purchase of a condo, you'll get, this brand name speaker, where it's, clearly you're dealing with a third-party brand that will be installing sort of a third-party branded speaker or other smart device. What we're seeing a lot more is actually more white labeled and seamlessly integrated smart devices, smart integrated security functions, smart locks, where residents can just sort of walk in and walk out and unlock their door and their commons doors, delivery functions and delivery boxes, infotainment systems, or as you mentioned, voice activated functions. Most of these are generally in the units themselves and sort of the space themselves is sort of squarely within that person's living space, but some of them are also integrated into the common spaces or the common shared ownership of the building itself. So if we sort of just assume that these are in the case of the white labeled ones, where you're not quite clear, who is providing this smart device or this digital service, there's certain questions that come up about who is collecting the personal information and who is sort of accountable for this personal information. Is the information being used squarely to provide some kind of a utility service, or is it actually some kind of commercial interaction that's going on as well? There could be lots of players involved. There could be the property manager and the board. There could be sort of the third-party supplier who created this technology or is providing the service. It could be utility, or it could be sort of the developer's business management system that has sort of kind of retained some kind of control over the data networks and the systems over the building after they've sort of been sold off. And we can imagine that from, say, a resident or an owner perspective, there's going to be these questions about what information am I giving to, how it's going to be used, if it's going to be transferred or disclosed to someone else. These are certainly questions that a privacy commissioner would be certainly interested in the coming time as a sort of a developing area, especially if there's sort of an information exchange for commercial activity. From the sort of business perspective, of course, the involved parties were going to want to ensure that there's some kind of papered data transfer arrangement, for example, between the property managers and suppliers and utilities, and the telcos, or whoever perhaps involved, and sort of aligning sort of who has responsibility with obtaining consent, and how would you even perhaps obtain that in sort of the scope of these integrated systems, who has responsibility and accountability for this information, and when things go wrong, who has also responsibility for that. So there's a lot of questions sort of that come up with this, and currently our sort of privacy regime is very consent focused, but we can imagine a lot of these tools may not be easily sort of integrated or manageable, or even consider this sort of consent-based regime. And I would be remiss if I wouldn't say that these questions that we're sort of considering for the session, in particular when we're talking about sort of personal information that's collected in the course of a commercial activity, which could certainly involve some of these smart integrated devices, these questions are going to be, so while you're thinking of these questions now, you'll also want to think down the road and down the future, because currently Canada's private sector privacy laws are completely being overhauled. Right, Quebec, as many of you already know, has already issued its Bill 64. We are expecting a draft of the modernized federal Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, or PIPEDA. We're also expecting changes from BC and Alberta, and Ontario is even in the middle of a consultation to determine whether they should be issuing their own sort of private sector privacy laws. So these questions around the technology that are being brought into these residential projects, the information is collected, and whether consent is a cornerstone of the parties being able to use this information, and whether they're being used for reasonable purposes. These are certainly important questions to ask, but parties involved will also want to think down the road and down the future, because these laws will be quite different and resemble quite a bit to the GDPR in Europe as early as some of them next year and into 2022.
Thanks, Karl. It's especially now, future-proofing is definitely a good idea when you're considering, projects that may be a hole in the ground right now, but 2 years from now are going to be fully built and be under a completely different privacy regime. Karl, I just want to ambush you with a question that we didn't prepare. Karl loves this. What about transfers of personal information across borders? This question comes up all the time. Can you do it? Is it allowed in Canada?
Sure. Are you thinking about outside of Canada in particular?
Transfers across into the US typically.
Sure. So if we're talking about, let's talk about two buckets first. So the first bucket, let's talk about private sector organizations. So we're talking about those who may be subject to PIPEDA or one of our provincial statutes. Currently, there's nothing that suggests that information cannot leave Canada. Certain privacy commissioners have even come out and stated that there's nothing in statutes that prohibit the transfer of information, let's say, going to the United States. The question is not so much where the information is, but whether the organization that collected the information in Canada and is perhaps transferring it, or transferring to a service provider that might be sitting in the United States, has entered in sort of a contractual arrangement with that provider, and has provided adequate provisions in that agreement to ensure that the information remains as safe as if it had never left Canada. So you can think of very typical provisions around sort of ensuring security and restrictions on use, breach provisions, provisions on restricting subcontractors and how they can use it, retention and destruction. So a lot of the standard provisions you might see. So there's certainly nothing outright that prohibits it, but it's certainly something to consider. On the other bucket that might be at play and important to some of our listeners is those who may be working with a public entity. In particular, in British Columbia and Nova Scotia, where public sector entities say if you're a private company and you would be processing information on behalf of, say, a provincial public body in BC, there are restrictions on information leaving Canada that are completely prohibited. So you could be quite restricted from, if you were to engage with those public entities, you could be facing restrictions on having that information stored outside of Canada, and would have to make arrangements to ensure that the information is localized in Canada.
Thanks, Karl. We're just coming up on time. Jody, I'll give you the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Any insights you'd like to provide before we do this again next year and everything has changed again?
I don't think it's going to change back. I guess, you know, what you said about the thought that needs to go into planning a project now for what the future will look like, whether it's from a legal perspective or whether from a utilization perspective, that future proofing and pre-planning of the development of any asset right now is vital. We have to think about not only, you know, what are we using technology for today, but what will it be used for many, many years to come. And what we've found is that thinking is not yet finding its way into the documents that are handed over to us quite often to look at and price, plan, and build. It's taking some effort throughout the process, and we might have a project that is planned 5 years in advance of shovels even hitting the ground, and it may take another 4 years to build that project. By the time you've gone through that process, the technology, as we've seen, has radically changed. So we need to develop models and thinking that is as dynamic as the technology that is fueling them. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to next year.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.